Have you ever felt that the more you give, the more she pulls away? That the more you strive to prove your worth, the less it seems to matter to her? I want you to stop for a second. Breathe, because what you are about to hear, you will not find in any self-help book with a pastel cover, nor in any of those empty speeches that tell you that love conquers all, and that if you are a good person, someone will appreciate it. No. What I am going to tell you today is uncomfortable, and if it is uncomfortable, it is because it touches something real. Think about the last time you sent a message and waited for a reply staring at the screen. Think about the last time you changed your plans so she would be comfortable. Think about the last conversation in which you gave in, even though you did not want to, in which you swallowed something that bothered you because you did not want to seem confrontational, because you did not want her to get angry, because deep down you were afraid that if you said what you thought, she would leave. And here is the question nobody dares to ask you out loud. What if that is precisely what is pushing her away? I am not blaming you. That is the first thing I want to make clear. Nobody taught you this. In fact, quite the opposite. From a young age, you were told that being a good boy was the key. That if you treated her well, if you were available, if you were attentive and caring, and never let her down, you would get what you wanted in a relationship. The movies told you that. The songs told you that. Your family told you that. Your friends told you that. And they did not know either. And you believed it because it made sense. Because it seemed fair. If you give a lot, you receive a lot. That is how the world works, right? But there is something that psychology has been studying for decades, and that is still not taught in any school, in any class, in any place where men are prepared to navigate the world of relationships. And it is this: desire does not work like gratitude. Desire does not grow because someone is generous with you. Desire grows in tension, in mystery, in space, in uncertainty. Desire dies slowly when there is too much certainty, too much availability, too much need for approval. And right now, as you listen to this, a part of you may want to reject it. You may think, but that is cold. That is distant. That is not real love. And you are right about one thing. It has nothing to do with love. It has to do with attraction. And those are two completely different things. You can love someone deeply and feel no desire for that person. You can desire someone intensely without loving them yet. They are distinct brain mechanisms activated by different things, and if you mix the two without understanding them, you end up doing exactly the opposite of what you want to achieve. Let me tell you something that psychologist John Bowlby discovered when he spent decades studying human attachment. Bowlby observed that human beings have attachment styles that form in childhood and that we then repeat almost automatically in every adult relationship. And one of the most common and most destructive patterns is anxious attachment. Anxious attachment appears in people who, in some way, learned that love was not guaranteed, that if they did not do enough, if they were not attentive, if they did not constantly monitor the relationship, something could break. And that creates a chronic state of emotional alertness, a hypervigilance that detects every change in the other person's tone of voice, every delay in replying to a message, every moment of distance as a threat. Do you recognize that? Because if you do, you are not crazy. You are not weak. You are responding exactly as a nervous system trained for fear responds. The problem is not that you feel that. The problem is acting from that place, because when you act from the fear of abandonment, you make decisions that do exactly what you fear. They push the person away. Now, I need you to understand something about how attraction works from a neurological point of view, because this changes everything. In the human brain, desire and motivation are governed primarily by a neurotransmitter you have surely heard mentioned, dopamine. But most people have a mistaken idea of what dopamine actually does. It is believed to be the pleasure molecule, the one that activates when we like something, but that is only part of it. What dopamine really does is create motivation towards something uncertain. Dopamine fires more powerfully in the face of the possibility of a reward, not the certainty of one. Researchers at MIT conducted an experiment that illustrates this perfectly. They trained a monkey so that when a light appeared, it pressed a lever and received juice. At first, dopamine fired when the juice arrived, when it received the reward. But after a while, when the pattern was predictable and safe, dopamine moved forward. It began firing with the light, that is, with the signal that there might be a reward, not with the reward itself. And when the juice did not come, when the expectation was not met, levels dropped sharply. The most revealing part was when they made the reward random. Sometimes the juice came, sometimes it did not. The monkey's dopaminergic system became literally obsessed with that lever. Uncertainty created a far more powerful motivation than certainty. And what does that have to do with you and your relationships? Absolutely everything. When you are available 24 hours a day, when you respond in seconds, when you cancel your plans at her slightest gesture, when there is never any space, never any mystery, never anything she has to wait for or wonder about, her dopaminergic system calms down. And when the dopaminergic system calms down in the context of a relationship, what calms down with it is desire, intrigue, the urge to seek you out. Not because she is a bad person, not because she does not value you, but because that is how the human brain works. The same brain you have, the same one she has, the same one any person on the face of the earth has. Now then, this is where it gets interesting, because what I have just described is not a license to play with someone, to act hard to get, to create anxiety in a manipulative way. That is a caricature of what actually works, and anyone who has tried that game consciously and coldly knows it shows, it repels, it is exactly as empty as the other extreme. The real space, the real mystery, the kind that genuinely attracts, is not a tactic, it is a consequence. It is the natural consequence of a man who has his own life, his own goals, his own limits, and who does not turn any woman into the absolute center of his emotional universe. There is a fundamental difference between a man who is not available because he is playing hard to get, and a man who is not available because he is genuinely building something. One is perceived as an empty strategy, the other is perceived as a man worth having, and people, women included, have an extraordinarily precise detector for telling the two apart. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." This applies powerfully to relationships. The way you react to uncertainty, to the ebb and flow of another person's attention, reveals everything about your internal state. And that internal state is what she is truly responding to. Not your words, not your gestures, but the unshakable center you carry within yourself. Let me talk to you now about something very few people dare to name clearly: emotional tests. I am not talking about something women do consciously, sitting down to plan how you are going to react. It does not work that way. It works in a much more instinctive, much more automatic way. When a woman starts to feel something for someone, when real attachment begins to form, her nervous system does something completely natural. It needs to know who it is dealing with. It needs to know whether that person is stable or whether they are going to fall apart, whether they will hold their character under pressure or whether they will abandon themselves at the first sign of tension. And that information is not obtained by asking directly. It is obtained by observing how that person reacts when there is discomfort. When she is distant one day with no apparent explanation, when she cancels a plan, when she says something hurtful and then acts as if nothing happened, when she goes cold for no visible reason. In those moments, a part of her, completely below the conscious level, is watching. How does he react? Does he fall apart? Does he call 20 times? Does he send long messages full of explanations? Does he beg her to talk? Or does he maintain his rhythm, his calm, his presence without his world collapsing? And here is the part you need to engrave in your mind. The panic reaction does not generate compassion. It generates distance. Not because she is cruel, but because the panic reaction confirms exactly what part of her feared, that beneath everything good you were showing, there is an enormous need for her validation. And need does not generate attraction. Need generates pity or suffocation or both at the same time. This does not mean you have to be made of stone. It does not mean you cannot feel, cannot suffer, cannot be confused. It means something far more nuanced, that you do not turn your emotional state into her responsibility, that you do not use her as a regulator for your own nervous system, that you do not transfer to her the task of making you feel good about yourself. There is a concept in clinical psychology called emotional regulation, and it is exactly what its name suggests: the capacity to manage your own emotional states without needing the outside world to do it for you. And the studies on adult attachment, those of Mario Michelin, those of Philip Shaver, Studies that have been documenting for decades how real relationships between adults actually work show something consistent. The people with the greatest security and attachment, those who maintain the most satisfying and stable relationships, are not the ones who never feel anxiety. They are the ones who know how to manage it without letting it spill over onto the other person. Let me now tell you about something you have probably experienced in some form. That moment when a relationship starts to go, well, starts to flow, and suddenly a part of you starts looking for the problem. That starts examining every detail, looking for warning signs. That interprets a neutral tone of voice as coldness, a quiet day as distance, a silence as rejection. And the more you look for the problem, the more tension you create. And the more tension you create, the harder it becomes for the other person to be close to you without feeling like they have to walk on eggshells. That is the hyper-vigilant nervous system in action, and it has a completely coherent internal logic. If you grew up in an environment where affection was unpredictable, where one day everything was fine and the next something had changed without warning, your brain learned that the best way to survive emotionally was to anticipate, to detect the problem before it arrived, to always be on alert. That mechanism protected you at some point. But in your adult relationships, that same mechanism creates exactly what you fear. The prophecy fulfills itself. Now comes something I want you to listen to carefully, because it is one of the most misunderstood concepts when it comes to relationships between men and women. There is a lot of talk about emotional leadership, about the man needing to lead, and that creates confusion because some people interpret leading as dominating, controlling, imposing, and that is not only wrong, it is at the exact opposite end of what actually works. Emotional leadership in a relationship has nothing to do with control. It has to do with direction, with knowing where you are going, with having clarity about what you want and what you do not want, with not needing the other person's constant approval to stay firm in your decisions. Think of a ship's captain in the middle of a storm. The crew does not feel safe when the captain nervously asks each sailor what he should do. The crew feels safe when the captain reads the situation, makes a decision, and communicates it calmly. The captain may be frightened inside, may have doubts, may not be 100% certain, but he maintains his composure because he knows his emotional state directly affects everyone else's emotional state. In an intimate relationship, it works in a similar way. Not because the woman is part of the crew, do not take it that literally, but because human beings tend to co-regulate our nervous systems with the people close to us. When you are with someone anxious, you feel more anxiety. When you are with someone calm, you tend to calm down. And in a romantic relationship, where there is a much greater level of intimacy and exposure, that co-regulation is even more intense. The person who maintains greater emotional stability, regardless of gender, tends to generate a greater sense of security. And security, paradoxically, is one of the great catalysts of long-term desire. There is a researcher called John Gottman who spent decades studying real couples in a laboratory and was able to predict with more than 90% accuracy which couples would stay together and which would not, simply by observing how they interacted for 15 minutes. And what was the most powerful predictor of breakup? Not arguments, not disagreement, contempt. Contempt in any of its forms, rolling the eyes, a condescending tone, veiled mockery, minimizing what the other person feels. Because contempt communicates something devastating, that the other person does not deserve your basic respect as a human being. And once respect disappears, nothing else works. But there is something else Gottman documented, and it has a direct relationship to what we were talking about earlier. The couples that remained stable were not the ones that never argued. They were the ones who, during moments of tension, maintained what he called repair attempts. Small signals, sometimes barely perceptible, that even though there was conflict, there was still connection. And the couples where one or both of them had an uncontrolled emotional escalation during conflict, where they lost the thread of what they wanted to say and ended up attacking the person instead of talking about the problem, were the ones that statistically ended. And why? Because when the nervous system enters a state of high activation, when the heart rate exceeds a certain number of beats, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning, empathy, and effective communication, the prefrontal cortex, partially disconnects. And what is left in charge is the limbic system, which operates from fear, attack, or flight. In that state, it is literally impossible to have a productive conversation. The brain is not processing information rationally. It is in survival mode. That is why one of the most powerful things you can do in a moment of relational tension is not to demand that everything be resolved right now, not to force a conversation that neither of you is in a position to have, but simply to pause, not to avoid the conflict, to return to the conflict from a place where both of you can actually communicate. And here we arrive at something I want to develop more carefully, because I believe it is the core of everything we are talking about: silence. Not silence as punishment, not the cold and calculated silence of someone who wants to cause harm, but silence as a practice of self-control, as a signal that you do not need to react to every stimulus immediately, as a demonstration that you have access to a version of yourself that does not operate from urgency. In an era where everyone is available at all times, where the immediate response has become the norm, where the absence of reaction is automatically interpreted as indifference or as a problem, the capacity to not react immediately has become extraordinarily rare. And what is rare has value. The man who does not send the furious message at 2 o'clock in the morning, the man who does not respond to a provocation with another provocation, the man who can sit with discomfort without needing to resolve it immediately, that man communicates something without saying a single word. He communicates that he has himself. Now, I need to talk to you about something that probably nobody has told you directly, and that has the potential to completely change how you understand your relationships. Most of the problems men have in their relationships do not come from what they do. They come from where they are coming from when they do it. There is an enormous difference between a man who is attentive and caring because he genuinely takes pleasure in being that way, because that is his natural way of relating, and a man who is attentive and caring because deep down he is afraid that if he stops being that way, he will lose her. The behavior can be exactly the same. The effect it generates is completely different. Why? Because people perceive the energy from which you act, even if they cannot articulate it rationally. People feel whether what you give comes from abundance or from scarcity, whether what you give comes from strength or from fear. They do not read it consciously. They do not analyze it. They have no words to explain it, but they notice it. And when what you give comes from the fear of losing, it generates in the other person a feeling that is hard to describe, but very easy to recognize. The feeling that you have too much at stake, that any move could break you, and that generates enormous pressure on the relationship, and especially on the other person. Nobody wants to feel that they are the only reason someone is doing well. It is too much responsibility. It is suffocating. That is why, paradoxically, the man who has a rich life outside the relationship, who has friendships, projects, passions, goals that excite him regardless of whether she is there or not, that man is more attractive, not because the relationship matters to him less, but because his well-being does not depend exclusively on her. And that, far from creating distance, generates the opposite effect. She knows he is there because he wants to be, not because he needs to be. There is a Stoic philosopher, Marcus Aurelius, who wrote in his Meditations something that has been relevant for almost 2,000 years because it touches something profoundly human. He wrote about the distinction between what is in our control and what is not. The actions of others, their decisions, their emotions, their choices, are not in our control. The only thing completely in our control is our response to all of that. And the person who has internalized that distinction, who does not waste energy trying to control what they cannot control, who directs all that energy toward what they can shape, that person operates from a completely different place. It is the Stoic equivalent of what modern psychology calls internal locus of control. Research on psychological well-being shows consistently that people with a greater internal locus of control, those who perceive that their life outcomes depend primarily on their own actions and decisions, rather than on external circumstances or the decisions of others, have greater emotional stability, greater resilience in the face of adversity, and interestingly, more satisfying relationships. Because someone with an internal locus of control does not need the other person to behave in a certain way in order to be okay. They can adapt. They can choose how to respond. They can hold themselves, and that holding, that stability under pressure, is exactly what generates respect. Not admiration for what you have or what you achieve, respect for who you are when things are not going well. Because anyone can be charming when everything is calm. The real question is who you are when there is turbulence, when she is in a bad mood and lets you know it, when the conversation gets difficult, when you feel like you are losing ground in the relationship. In that moment, what shows up? If what shows up is the version of you that shrinks, that apologizes for existing, that folds in on itself to avoid conflict, that version does not generate respect. It generates something called contempt, exactly the variable Gottman identified as the greatest predictor of breakup. And the tragic thing is that version of you probably believes it is being kind, being considerate, preserving the peace. But the peace bought with your own dignity is not peace. It is surrender. And surrender, even if it relieves tension in the short term, erodes something that is very hard to recover: mutual respect. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius also wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." When your thoughts are colored by fear and need, your soul reflects that. You become anxious, preoccupied, and distracted from your own life. But when you release that attachment, when you focus on your own purpose and growth, you become a person of substance. And that substance is what attracts others without effort. There is one thing that men who have genuinely worked on this, who have gone through the real process of understanding themselves, describe in a similar way when they look back. They say that the biggest mistake they made was not being too good or too caring. The mistake was that their goodness, their attention, their affection was not accompanied by any backbone. It was generosity without limits. It was giving without any structure, without any principle to sustain it, and love without structure. Love without clear limits is not love in its healthiest form. It is dependence disguised as love, and the difference, even if it is subtle from the inside, is clearly perceived from the outside. So, the question is not how to be less caring. The question is how to be caring from a place of genuine strength, how to maintain warmth without losing clarity, how to keep being generous without turning that generosity into an indirect mechanism of control, which also happens, which also exists. The man who gives constantly but keeps score, who offers but expects that offering to be acknowledged in a particular way, who is attentive but deep down is buying validation. That man also operates from scarcity, even if he disguises it with generosity. There is something I want you to ask yourself honestly. When you do something for her, when you organize a dinner, when you are available, when she needs you, when you give her your time and your attention, would you do it the same way if you knew there was no emotional reward on the other side? Would you do it if you knew it was not going to translate into more closeness, more affection, more approval? If the answer is no, if deep down there is an implicit transaction, then what you think is love is actually a strategy. A strategy born from fear, and strategies born from fear always, sooner or later, reveal what lies beneath. Now, we arrive at the point that I think the most people need to hear, and that the fewest people say directly. The moment a woman pulls away, the moment she asks for space, the moment there is distance and silence and a feeling that something is cooling, that moment is exactly the moment when most men make the biggest mistake, and that mistake is to chase. It is trying to resolve the distance with more presence. It is filling the space with messages, with calls, with conversations that seek to recover what feels like it is being lost, and it makes complete sense from the inside. If something moves away, you get closer. If there is a problem, you try to solve it. If someone is distant, you seek contact. That makes sense in many areas of life. But in attraction, in the dynamics of desire, it works exactly in reverse. The more pressure you apply, the more resistance you generate. The more you chase, the more legitimate the distance becomes. Not because she is cruel or because she is playing games with you, but because the chase confirms precisely the dynamic that makes desire fade, that you need her more than you need yourself. Psychologist Albert Bandura spent decades studying what he called self-efficacy, an individual's belief in their own capacity to execute the behaviors necessary to produce certain results. And he found that high self-efficacy not only improves performance in concrete tasks, but transforms the way a person relates to failure, uncertainty, and challenges. A person with high self-efficacy sees a challenge and thinks, "This is difficult, but I have what I need to handle it." A person with low self-efficacy sees the same challenge and thinks, "This could destroy me." Now, Apply that to your relationships. When someone pulls away, when there is tension, when there is uncertainty, what message do you send yourself? Can I handle this? Do I have the resources to navigate discomfort without losing myself? Or is this the beginning of the end? Do I have to act now, or I will lose everything? The difference between those two messages completely determines how you are going to act, and how you act in that moment determines whether the distance becomes a positive turning point or the beginning of a downward spiral. There is something I want to name for you because I believe it is one of the most liberating things you can understand about yourself. The fear of abandonment, that feeling of panic when you sense that someone important might leave, does not speak to your worth. It speaks to what you learned about love at some point in your history. It speaks to the patterns your brain formed when you were young and could not yet choose how to relate to fear. That is not a life sentence. It is a starting point because what was learned can be unlearned. What the brain automated can be redirected. Not overnight, not with a rational decision, but with constant practice, with repeated exposure to situations in which you choose to respond differently, even when the impulse is to return to the old pattern. That is precisely what modern neuroscience calls neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself, to create new neural connections in response to new experiences. And that capacity does not disappear with age. It is not something only children have. It is something adults have too, even if it requires more effort, more awareness, more repetition, but it works. And the first step is exactly what you are doing right now, naming the patterns, because what has no name cannot be changed. What cannot be seen cannot be transformed. Let me talk to you now about something concrete, something you can start doing differently from today, not as a tactic, not as a seduction strategy, but as a genuine practice of self-knowledge. Start observing with genuine curiosity and without judgment from where you act in your relationship. When you send that message, do you send it because you want to or because you need to? When you give in on something, do you do it because you genuinely do not mind or because you are afraid of the reaction if you do not give in? When you agree with her, is it because you genuinely share her point of view or because disagreement creates a discomfort you prefer to avoid? I am not telling you that the answer to all of this is always to say no. Always to impose your point of view, always to create conflict where there could be peace. That would be just as unbalanced as the other extreme. I am telling you to start distinguishing between the flexibility that comes from maturity, from the genuine capacity to see things from another perspective, and the flexibility that comes from fear, from the inability to bear the tension of disagreement. One makes you grow, the other hollows you out. There is a phrase that belongs to the Stoic tradition, but has a direct equivalent in contemporary psychology. First understand, then respond. Epictetus put it more harshly. It is not what happens to you that determines you, but what you do with what happens to you. In modern terms, between the stimulus and the response, there is a space, and in that space lies your freedom. That space is exactly what most people do not know exists. They react automatically from the old pattern, from the immediate impulse, and then wonder why the results keep being the same. Building that space, making that pause wider, more conscious, is the most important work you can do, not just in your relationships, in your entire life. Because the man who knows how to make that pause, who can sit with discomfort without needing to resolve it on the spot, who can observe his own impulses without being governed by them, that man has an inner strength that is not won in any gym, and it shows, not because he proclaims it, but because it is perceived in how he speaks, in how he moves, in how he reacts when things do not go according to plan. I want you to imagine for a moment two versions of yourself. The first version is in an argument with her. The words have become difficult. The tone has risen. There is something in the air that could break, and that first version feels the panic, feels that this needs to be resolved now, that she needs to understand, that she needs to acknowledge he is right, that the situation needs to be okay again as soon as possible. And from that place, he says things he did not want to say, demands things he should not demand, or on the contrary, gives in on something he should not give in on, because urgency does not allow for thinking. Urgency only allows for reacting. The second version of you is in the same situation, the same difficult words, the same elevated tone. And this version feels exactly the same on the inside. the same discomfort, the same unease, the same impulse to do something to make the tension disappear. But this version recognizes the impulse without automatically obeying it. This version breathes. This version says, "I need a moment before we continue with this," and says it without apology, without drama, without it seeming like a retreat, and then comes back to the conversation when in a position to have it. And when he comes back, the conversation has a completely different quality. Which of the two versions generates more respect? Which of the two has a better chance of resolving the conflict in a way that both come out well? Which of the two is she more likely to remember afterwards? Not with resentment, but with something close to admiration. I am not painting you a utopia. The second version requires work. It requires practice. It requires having failed many times as the first version, and having decided that you want to build something different. But it is possible. And not only is it possible, it is necessary. Because if you do not do that work on yourself, if you do not progressively become the second version, what you will keep reproducing in every relationship is the same pattern. And the pattern will keep generating the same results. There is one last thing I want you to take away from everything we have talked about today, and it is this. Real transformation does not begin when you change what you do. It begins when you change what you believe you are and what you believe you deserve. Because all your behaviors in a relationship, your entire way of relating to desire, to fear, to closeness, and to distance are built on an image of yourself that was formed a long time ago. An image that perhaps tells you that you need to earn the affection of others, that if you are not constantly attentive, you will lose what you have. That your worth as a person depends on whether the person beside you is satisfied with you. And that image, even if it is unconscious, even if you have never put it into words, directs your life. It directs your choices. It directs how you position yourself in your relationships. And as long as you do not examine it, as long as you do not question it, as long as you do not begin to build a different image based on what you truly are, and not on what fear has convinced you that you need to do in order to be loved, you will keep repeating the same mistakes with different people. That is the real work. It is not learning techniques. It is not memorizing phrases that sound confident. It is going inward. It is understanding why you do what you do. It is learning to be alone with yourself without that feeling like a threat. It is building a life that makes sense to you, regardless of whether someone is beside you to validate it. Because when you build that, when you have that, everything else changes. Not magically, not overnight, but it changes because you change. And when you change on the inside, what you attract from the outside cannot be the same. The man who has genuinely worked on this does not chase, does not beg, does not explain, does not convince. He simply is. And there is something in that simply being, in that presence, that needs to prove nothing, that is extraordinarily powerful. Not because it is a trick, but because it is real. And the real, in a world full of performances and masks and calculated versions of oneself, is the most scarce and most valuable thing that exists. You are capable of building that, but it starts here. It starts now. It starts by choosing that your next reaction will be more yours and less the fear you carry inside. Seneca wrote, "True happiness is to enjoy the present without anxious dependence on the future." When you are present in your own life, when you are not anxiously dependent on her approval, you become the kind of man others naturally respect. And that respect is visible. It is felt. And it is deeply attractive. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus also taught, "No great thing is created suddenly." This applies to the process of becoming the man who is centered in himself. It does not happen overnight. It happens through repeated practice, through the decision to respond differently each time the fear arises. And each time you do, you build the evidence that you are someone who can handle uncertainty. And that evidence accumulates until it becomes who you are. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." When you cultivate thoughts of purpose, growth, and self-respect, your soul reflects that. And she will see it, she will feel it, and she will be drawn to it. Because in a world of men who are chasing, a man who is centered in himself is a rare and precious thing. Be that man. Build that life. And watch how everything changes. If you made it to the end of this video, comment "I made it," and I will personally reply to you. And if this resonated with you, subscribe to be part of this and hit like if you enjoyed it.